So welcome to this Bristol University Press webinar. It's held in association with the Equality Trust and the Fairness Foundation, represented by Priya and Will here. Today we're going to be talking about the burning question of wealth inequality in Britain. So thank you so much everyone for joining us today. My name's Jess Miles. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at Bristol University Press. I'll be chairing the event today. We'll be running until 2:15, depending on the number of questions we have, but we really want to make sure that we can get through all of your questions. So very pleased to welcome our panelists. I'll just give a short introduction to them all. Stewart Lansley is the author of The Rich Are the Poorer, How Britain Enriched the Few and Failed the Poor, a 200-year history. He's a visiting fellow at the University of Bristol and a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum. Priya Sahni-Nicholas is co-executive director of the Equality Trust, a national charity that campaigns to improve quality of life by dismantling structural inequalities of income, wealth and power. Her remit includes external affairs, communications and media, and new business development. Will Snell is chief executive of the Fairness Foundation, a charity that aims to challenge the conversation about fairness in the UK by arguing that the only way to achieve a fairer society is to reduce inequality in all its forms. Before setting up the Fairness Foundation in 2021, he worked at the Tax Justice Network and Global Witness and was the founder and first chair of Tax Justice UK. Welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to do this today. So each of our panelists will be speaking for 10 minutes and there'll be a chance for you all to ask questions at the end. Before we start, I just have a few housekeeping points to mention. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. Please use that to type your questions and I'll put them to the panelists in the second half of the session. You can answer questions at any point, so they all stay there and then I can run through them towards the end. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat. Thank you very much to my colleague Martha, who is behind the scenes and managing all that today. We have closed captions enabled on this webinar. There's a caption button at the bottom of the screen, so you can use this to show or hide the text as you prefer. We're also going to be giving you a discount code so you can order Stewart's book, The Rich Are the Poorer, at half price. It's just £10. The code is LAN50, which you can use at the checkout on the Bristol University Press website. We'll be putting links in the text during the course of the event. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards. We'll hope to get that over to you in the next few days. So that's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to Stewart to get us underway.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody who's joining in. And thank you for Bristol University Press for hosting this event. When we started talking about this a few months ago, it wasn't that topical an issue, but it's suddenly become a sort of hot political issue in just the last few weeks. And the reason for that, of course, is that Labour has got a lot of publicity for the fact that it is basically claimed it's not going to raise taxes on wealth, while the Conservative Party have responded by saying, you know, they might even abolish or cut inheritance tax. Now, the reason why this is an important debate, and it ought to be higher up the political agenda, is that the way we generate wealth, the way we share it, and the effect that it has profound implications for economic strength, social resilience, and life chances of ordinary people. We can illustrate this by looking at some of the key trends of the last 30 or 40 years. The first major change in the question of wealth has been that it has grown much more quickly. The level of national wealth, private and public, and that includes things like property, financial assets, pension holdings, has risen at twice the rate of the size of the economy. So it's now worth 7 times. The national wealth pool is worth 7 times the size of the economy, compared with about 3 times 30 or 40 years ago. The second thing to say is that as the wealth pool has grown, it's become much more heavily owned by private individuals. So the share of wealth that was owned collectively by the state and by mutual organizations and so on was around 30% in the post-war years. It's now around 10%. The private sector, essentially private individuals and the private sector, own 90% of the national wealth pool. And the third key trend is that wealth has become much more concentrated at the top. It's become much more unequal, and that's reversed a very long-term trend towards greater wealth equality up to the end of the 1970s. And the other key factor about wealth is that it's incredibly lowly taxed, much more lowly taxed, despite its size and despite its growth. It's very, very lowly taxed compared with earnings. So, how are we to interpret these trends? Is this great surge in wealth the product? I mean, it could be, and in fact, it would be good news if this great surge was the product of wealth, a huge surge in wealth creation, an historic high in levels of innovation, in levels of investment, in a great surge in entrepreneurialism. If these factors were at work, we would see the level of wealth, the reflection of wealth creation, of a much bigger cake, and contributing to the common good. But this isn't what's happened. In fact, Britain recently, in the last sort of few decades, has historically had very low levels of innovation, very low levels of investment, and very low levels of creation of new wealth. Most of this increase in wealth in recent times has been the product of essentially unearned factors. It's not the reward for great surge in entrepreneurialism. It's the result of factors that bring a kind of windfall gain to people with wealth. There are two main reasons for this great surge in wealth. The first is inflation and asset values. And of course, inflation and asset values, which are often generated by state activity itself. So these are windfall gains, or what the philosopher John Stuart Mill called getting rich while asleep. The second main factor is that far from being the product of new wealth creation, it's actually been the result of what we might call wealth extraction or wealth appropriation. And this is the result of essentially corporate power and the elite control of resources. And this involves the redistribution of the existing cake in favor with those with wealth already. So there are various ways in which wealth extraction has become commonplace in the British economy, but essentially it's a way in which the corporate sector has turned companies into cash cows for executives and owners at the expense of productive activity that would expand the cake. So what's really been happening is that a range of business practices that have been geared to personal enrichment rather than long-term investment and long-term investment and strengthening of companies. I think the key lesson from this is that big increases in national personal wealth that are not the result of productive activity, but of extraction, serve no useful purpose. Indeed, they often have a significant negative effect. What this debate is really about is the question of ownership. Who owns the economy? You know, how much of it should be collectively owned and how much should be individually owned. And what's happened is that we've had a big switch in the model of ownership. After the war, the egalitarian governing philosophy of the time increased the share of wealth that was collectively owned. Utilities, mutuals, and other forms of socialization of wealth. So the state owned something like 30% of wealth. What we've had since then is a sort of counter-revolution from the late 1970s against egalitarianism and a return to the individualization of wealth that proceeded before the Second World War. So Mrs. Thatcher used the term of a private property owning democracy, in which more and more individuals would own a portion of the wealth base, and she tried to do this through a series of measures, such as the sale of council houses and the privatization of mutual companies and nationalized industries. Essentially, we've had a 40-year experiment in the individualization of wealth, and we now have the evidence of the effect of that system. And there are four main effects. The first is we've had a massive erosion of the commons, of parts of society, parts of the economy that were effectively held in common. And this in many ways has been very similar, sort of parallel, to the process of enclosure that took place in the centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution and during the Industrial Revolution, when people's access to land was removed from them. And as a result, their livelihoods, their homes were removed. And the system of land tenure was effectively privatized. The second key effect is that nearly all the gains from this process of individualization have gone to the already rich. It's bypassed, you know, most ordinary people. The third effect, which I think is particularly significant, is led to a huge level of exclusion of ordinary people from access to the gains from wealth. You know, a classic example of this is access to affordable housing. There has been a severe decline in access to affordable housing. Indeed, the experiment in a property owning democracy through an encouragement of home ownership has been going backwards for a decade. So only half the under 40 age group are able to buy their own home compared with 30 years ago. The same has happened with shares, the ownership of companies. Back in the 70s, 56% of shares were owned by individuals. Now it's only 12%. And the British industry, British companies, are over 50% of the ownership of British companies are owned by overseas asset management companies. And the third factor, the last factor that's come about, is that we have these great diversity in life chances. It's actually made the gap in life chances worse and the level of social mobility much worse. And that's because if we look at the level of inheritance that takes place, the average inheritance payment is double in real terms what it was 20 years ago. And that obviously has greatly expanded the life chances of those in receipt of that inheritance compared with others. So I think that this really ought to be a very, very major issue. It ought to be rising up the political agenda, and we do need our politicians to bite the bullet on these issues about the negative effect these trends are having on society and on the economy. And yet it seems that it's an issue that our major politicians seem to be completely ignoring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stewart. Don't forget, ask any questions for Stewart or any of the panelists or all of the panelists in the Q&A. And we'll now go over to Priya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly? Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Okay. Sorry, just double checking. So thank you very much, Stewart, for that stark and frankly really quite depressing roundup of the situation we found ourselves in with regards to wealth inequality. So the first point I'd like to kind of emphasize or maybe re-emphasize is a better phrase here, is that this situation in which we see obscene levels of extreme wealth concentrated in a handful of just a few people, while at the other end of the spectrum we have working people who can't afford food or heating, it isn't the result of natural market forces. It's not an example of cream rising to the top or of especially hardworking, talented and astute individuals collecting the spoils that they deserve. It is an entirely man-made situation, and it's the result of centuries worth of policy decisions, essentially made by the rich and powerful, and designed either by accident or intention to increase or retain their riches and power. So if we've got centuries of decisions that have led us where we are today, will it take centuries of decisions to get us out? And what might that roadmap look like? So since the 1980s, I think Stewart touched on this as well, wealth inequality in the UK and many other developed nations has risen considerably, and that is reversing a general trend towards greater equality that had existed since about the early 1900s. So last year, the Equality Trust produced a report, Billionaire Britain, Inequality from the Top Down, which examined this extraordinary rise of billionaire wealth, and it examined the systems that allowed these unsustainable and obscene levels of inequality to take hold. So just a bit of stats on this. In 1990, which is the first year that the Sunday Times ran its rich list, there were 15 billionaires living in Britain. By 2022, there were 177. And billionaire wealth over that same 32-year period had increased by 1,000%, from 53 billion in 1990 to 653 billion in 2022. And it's not just wealth inequality that has risen. I just want to bring in a few stats here about income inequality as well. So recent figures from the High Pay Centre found that the average pay increase for FTSE 100 CEOs in 2022 was £500,000, taking the average salary to £3.91 million a year. And that's an average pay increase of 16%. And remember, this is in a year which saw record numbers of public sector workers, among others, struggling to secure below inflation pay rises. And just later this month, we're going to see junior doctors and consultants walk out together for the first time in history, having rejected less than inflation pay rises or pay offers. So alongside this exponential growth in wealth and income, for the first time in decades as well, extreme poverty is rising, with nearly 2 billion people worldwide living in countries where inflation has outstripped wage growth. So in the period April 2022 to March 2023, the Trussell Trust delivered 3 million emergency food parcels in the UK to people facing hardship. Citizens Advice found that in the first 6 months of 2023, 7.8 million people in Britain had to borrow money to cover their energy bills. And and alongside this, 1.2 million children are living in households which have had to go without heating, hot water and electricity. And this polarising wealth affects us all. More unequal societies, as the Spirit level has decisively demonstrated, experience poorer social, economic and health outcomes than more equal ones. While those at the top might be somewhat buffered against these external economic shocks through their accumulated wealth, this does come at the detriment of wider social outcomes. And the accumulation of extreme wealth by the world's richest individuals has now become an economic, ecological and human rights disaster, threatening political stability in countries all over the world. So, what action can we take? After 13 years of austerity, we think the time is ripe for radical change. The first recommendation I'm going to put forward on how to tackle structural inequalities of income, wealth and power is the introduction of universal basic services. And I just want to take a little meander here and tell a story which I think kind of nicely illustrates the why for universal basic services. So I was having a conversation with a group of people, and in this group there was an older musician, a parent with 2 teenage children, and a younger person in their 20s. The musician had said that they didn't have any pension provision, we're talking about the future, but they did have a second property which they were able to derive an income from, and from which they planned to live off when they could no longer work. The parent then chimed in and told us that they had bought a second property purely to provide their children with an income when they were at university. So the younger person in the group was absolutely appalled, and they relayed how prohibitive and expensive they were finding, them and their friends were finding the housing and rental markets, and outlined that it was people like these two who had made it impossible for them and their generation to have access to affordable housing. So there's no doubt that the actions of these reluctant landlords contributed to inequality, but neither of them were actively seeking to increase their wealth or to make a fortune. They were just trying to secure a future for themselves and their families. So if public services were better, if they were guaranteed, neither of them would have taken the action that they had. If the pension provision was there, if university education was free and living costs were manageable, they would not have bought second homes. Obviously, this is just one conversation, but it does nicely illustrate a point that without adequate public services, there is a tendency for every person to act in their own interests, and that this ultimately skews the markets, skews asset prices, and creates conditions in which only a very narrow range of people benefit, while ultimately others miss out. So, a guaranteed basic minimum for public services. The Equality Trust is supporting a campaign called the Social Guarantee, which believes that the primary goal of the economy should be to meet everybody's needs. And we're advocating for minimum standards in childcare, housing, transport, adult social care, and internet and communication. So there is quite widespread support for investment in public services in one form or another. Yet when investment is called for, there's always one question thrown back: where is the money going to come from? So there's one enormous myth that I'd kind of like to open up and dispel here and now. And the myth is that there's no money in the UK to adequately fund public services. And this is simply not true. The UK is the 5th richest country in the world. This really is a question of political will. Remember that it's decades worth of policy decisions that have allowed ultra wealthy individuals to use tax shelters and enjoy preferential treatment, to the extent that in most countries, including the UK, they pay a lower rate of tax than ordinary people. So talking of taxes, there are a range of options available for funding better public services. And these include, you can go after the tax that's owed but not paid. HMRC own figures show that in 2021-22, there was a tax gap of £35.8 billion, e.g. taxes that were not collected, either through non-payment, avoidance or fraud. And that figure is up £2 billion on the previous year. We can look at changes to the current tax system. Things like equalising capital gains tax with income tax could raise a further £15 billion a year. On this same topic, national insurance could also be applied to investments, and that could raise another £8.6 billion a year. There's no obvious reason why income earned without actually working should be taxed at a lower rate than income that is earned through actual work. There is another benefit here of equalising these taxes, and that is that actually equalising taxes on passive and investment income end up simplifying the tax system. And experts have said that this should substantially reduce tax avoidance, as it will limit the potential avenues for avoiding tax. Other changes include reforming non-dom status, which could raise a further £3.2 billion a year. And we could look at ending some of the loopholes within inheritance tax, as there's evidence that certain schemes such as the business relief and agricultural property relief, they're used by a small minority to avoid paying tax on their assets. So tweaks to the tax system and collecting all that is owed could raise around £60 billion a year. Obviously, new taxes could also be considered. So there's options to look at a wealth tax of around 1 to 2% on assets of over 10 million and above, and that could raise £22 billion a year. And this is a very small tax on those who are already at the very top of the distribution. It apparently would only affect 0.04% of the population, which is around 20,000 people. Other options are to introduce a 4% tax on share buybacks. Share buybacks are a way that example of how profits are being transferred with the sole purpose of avoiding taxes. So there could be a tax on buybacks, and there could be a windfall tax as well, which IPPR and Commonwealth say would raise £11 billion in a year. We could also look at a luxury goods tax. I think we need to recognise the double injustice that the nations, classes and groups of people who are most likely to be impacted by the climate crisis are the nations, groups and classes of people who contribute least to the climate emergency. And conversely, the people that are most responsible for the climate emergency are least likely to be impacted. And so we could have a look at luxury goods taxes and consumption taxes that could rectify that. Also, progressive consumption taxes. Now, these have been designed specifically to address inequality. Our current UK taxes are progressive, but rampant inequality still exists and actually has worsened. So experts reason that we need a specific tax approach that specifically addresses inequality. Some other non-tax changes that could and should be considered. So our billionaire report clearly showed that the financial sector, which has driven many of the shifts in inequality, is in dire need of reform. To move it away from the short-term thinking and extractivist practices, which have stunted the economy and driven inequality. Corporations also need to reform in order to be more democratic, and this could be achieved via the expansion of employee ownership and sectoral bargaining power. Reversing the privatisation of essential services also offers a lot of potential, not least as a tool to tackle spiralling prices of everyday necessities like energy. We could look at adopting community wealth building approaches, which would facilitate local economic development and shifting the emphasis away from global cities to local communities, and that would address regional inequalities. And finally, we need to consider what measures we can put in place to ensure that we don't just slip back. Recommendations from the Structural Inequalities Alliance state the importance of changing the architects of policy development, including but not limited to planning, decision-making and accountability.
Thank you, Priya. Thanks very much. Lots to think about there. Let's move on to Will. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about public attitudes to wealth and wealth inequality. Just by way of background, I run the Fairness Foundation, which is a relatively new charity that aims to change the debate about fairness and inequality in the UK, and argues that we don't currently have a shared vision of what a good society looks like, but also that we underestimate potential to reach agreement around this. And a fundamental tenet is that we can't achieve a fairer society without reducing inequality. We talk about fairness as having 5 aspects, what we call fair necessities. The first being everyone has their basic needs met. The second being everyone has genuinely equal opportunities to maximize their potential. The third, everyone is fairly rewarded for the work they do. The fourth, that we have reciprocity with people supporting the state through taxes and being supported by the state in return when they need it. And the fifth, that everyone is treated equally with equal respect and status. And we see wealth inequality as a barrier to the achievement of all 5 of those aspects of fairness, because it allows poverty to reach unacceptable levels. It leads to educational and job market inequalities, undervalues many forms of work and undermines the social contract. It weakens public services and undermines this idea of reciprocity, and it leads to egregious inequalities across class, race, gender, regional and generational divides across every aspect of our society and economy. In terms of the polling and where public attitudes are on wealth inequalities, we carried out some research earlier this year that showed that people are concerned about both the causes and the consequences of wealth inequality, as well as its nature, where it's at in the UK at the moment, as well as other forms of inequality, income inequality, and those interdependent forms of racial, gender, and regional inequality as well. We asked people back in May what they thought was an acceptable level of wealth, and most people found that £10 million was too much wealth for a range of reasons, both in principle and because of its practical consequences. And particularly, there was a consensus of concern among both Tory and Labour voters around the consequences of excessive wealth, around not paying their fair share of taxes, and the impact that this wealth inequality had on our democracy. And we found, for example, that 75% of people, including 72% of Tory voters in 2019, are concerned that people with net wealth of £10 million or more have too much influence on the political system. Almost as many, 69%, are concerned that people in the UK have that level of wealth while others live in poverty, and 65% were concerned about unequal opportunities to accumulate that wealth. We also found that 68% of people, and that included 64% of 2019 Tory voters, thought the government should be doing more to tax people with £10 million or more in wealth. And we also asked about perceptions of wealth and how they varied according to how the wealth had been accumulated. Had it been earned, or had it been accumulated in other ways? And the analysis from our National Wealth Surplus report shows that there was some gradation in views, but not as much as we expected. We asked people to give us their views around fairness and wealth in relation to 7 archetypes, people who come into wealth in various ways, for example, entrepreneurs, landlords, footballers, city traders, and so on. And we found unexpectedly that landlords came out second top in favourability after entrepreneurs. So the entrepreneurs coming top was not surprising, but we were surprised by the level of public support for landlordism, if you like, whereas city traders and even footballers came out much lower. There was much more concern about fairness in terms of their having accumulated wealth. Perhaps reasons for this might include that the footballer example was much more around income inequality than wealth inequality, and that's an easy concept for people to relate to. And possibly also that many people either are landlords themselves or know people who are landlords, very much coming back to Priya's example of this being perhaps the most widely available way of generating wealth, and therefore there being substantial public sympathy for that group. Well, of course, it's a very heterogeneous group, but that's not something that we explored in the polling. We did find, however, that many people recognise that wealth accumulation often owes more to luck than to quote-unquote merit. But they don't necessarily translate that into it not being fair, perhaps because they're thinking more about fairness in terms of fair process rather than fair outcomes. However, where we can align public concern around both fair process and fair outcomes, that is where there is real potential for building public support around an issue. And the example that Priya gave of equalising capital gains tax rates with tax on income is a good example of that, I think. A barrier in terms of public attitudes in this agenda, though, is that many people believe that we live in a meritocratic society, and this meritocratic myth is very embedded, and therefore believe that success and therefore wealth owes more to individual factors such as hard work than to structural factors such as barriers to opportunity and inequality. And of course, people see wealth as aspirational, in part because it can provide security for them and their families in an insecure and unequal world, as Priya alluded to. Another barrier, I think, is that people don't necessarily link poverty and wealth, because these structural cause and effect chains are incredibly complicated, and it's much easier to relate to stories about individual aspiration and success that don't try and engage with those underlying structural factors. It's easier to relate to or to understand or to think about stories around personal responsibility or people overcoming barriers to opportunity and social mobility. And that perhaps is one of the reasons why these arguments have historically, over the last 20 years or so, struggled to cut through with the majority of the public and to achieve the political salience that we would like them to have. Although, of course, that is perhaps changing at the moment, as Stewart mentioned earlier. And I think finally, another challenge is that views around inequality are driven more by perceptions than necessarily by reality. And people often underestimate levels of both wealth and income inequality. We did some polling in 2022 when we published the Fairness Index, in which people guessed that the poorest 20% of households in the UK have 6.4% of all wealth. In reality, they have just 0.6% of all wealth in the UK. They also guessed that the pay ratio between large company chief executives and their average employees was 15:1. And in reality, that ratio is 79:1. And there's been plenty of other evidence. There was a seminal US study carried out in 2010 where participants dramatically underestimated levels of wealth inequality and then constructed ideal wealth distributions that were far more equitable than even their erroneously low estimates of the actual distribution. And that was a preference that held for those on both sides of the political and wealth divide. And that's in the US, although admittedly 12, 13 years ago now. So how can we build support for action on wealth inequality? I think a lot of it is around how we frame the issues. And as both Stewart and Priya have explored, putting more focus on the damaging consequences of wealth inequality and then flipping it around and arguing for the benefits of a more equal society, which of course was very much the focus of the Spirit level as well as much of Stewart's work. And I think there are ways of talking about that in ways that can resonate across political divides. And of course, the Conservatives focus on levelling up, which is, ebbed and flowed over the last few years, but arguably hasn't entirely gone away, is a response to an aspect of that, albeit one very much focused, of course, on regional inequality, but one that perhaps, in some of its more thoughtful forms, including arguably parts of the government's levelling up white paper, does acknowledge and explore some of those links to other aspects of inequality, although not as much perhaps as those of us on this panel would like. I also think there's mileage in talking about the risks of wealth inequality and thinking about wealth inequality as a systemic risk for society and for our economy and to businesses, as well as to government and to individual citizens. I do think that there's an interesting trend among businesses in the UK, an appetite to speak out about government, the risks of inequality and the need for government to do more, in addition to the broader sort of responsible business agenda. And that's something we might see more on over the coming years, I hope. And finally, just to say that I think to change mindsets, we can't just appeal to individualistic mindsets, but we can't also purely talk in structural terms. We need to find a way of selling structural change to people who think individualistically, and it's difficult because it's complicated. But we can find ways to do that, and we can challenge, for example, the idea that economic liberty has primacy over all other forms of liberty, including positive freedoms and capabilities to maximize potential and well-being and so on and so forth. And as I think it's just to round off, as Stewart has alluded to already, we need to make people more aware of the links between private wealth and public impoverishment and what that means in practice. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Will. Thank you, everyone. We're going to move over to Q&A now. So please do put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Thank you all for those really insightful talks. It's really interesting to kind of get a sense of how things are and how things are potentially changing and what we can maybe do to kind of keep pushing that change in the right direction. I'll go to what I'm hoping to do is we've got about half an hour, 35 minutes left for questions. I'm hoping to get through as many as we can and then give the panelists a chance to do some summing up comments right at the end of the session. So the first question we have in is from Darren Priest. Thank you, Darren. He says, is there any state that demonstrates a model to work towards? I think this is possibly one you might all be able to answer, but Stewart, we'll start with you.
Is there a sort of a model country? Well, I mean, Britain is an outrider pretty well on the question of inequality. In terms of income inequality, we are, the second highest unequal nation amongst the rich world, behind the United States. The levels of inequality have actually increased in all countries, but not all countries, but on average, inequality amongst the OECD nations, the sort of the rich club of the world, has increased. But what's actually been happening over the last sort of 5 or 6 years is that they've been reaching a sort of peak in some other countries, whereas Britain is stayed high, and I think the latest evidence suggests it may have got even worse. So I think what's happening is that there is a new interest around the world in looking at the taxation of wealth. I mean, organizations like the IMF has said that we should be looking at wealth as a potential resource for social reconstruction. And some countries, such as Spain, have already implemented new wealth taxes. I mean, over time, there has been a significant reduction across the world in terms of the taxation of wealth, and still most wealth, most tax comes from earnings. I mean, remarkable that the wealth taxes in Britain account for 4% of the tax take. Taxes on earnings account for 60%. So I mean, you could point to the Scandinavian countries as, closer to the egalitarian ideal. But Britain was, a relatively equal country historically and internationally in the 1970s. We achieved peak equality and a low point for poverty at the end of the 1970s. If you lived in the 1970s, you may not have noticed this, but it was a significant historic moment. So it's perfectly, I wouldn't say there's a single country that's a model, but other leading rich countries have lower rates of inequality, have higher tax rates, have better public services. So I do think there are examples. I mean, one area I wanted to mention was the case of of people's capital, and rather than individual capital, having sort of social wealth funds that are owned by everybody on an equal basis. And there are 1 or 2 countries in the world which have this model. I mean, close to home, Shetland has this model. They charge the oil companies at the beginning of the oil process in the early 1980s, significant sums of money. They invested this in a people's fund, and they used the proceeds from that fund to fund social capital investment. So if you go to Shetland, you'll find that, I mean, they have incredibly good the social care, the very, very good leisure facilities, good public parks, and so on, funded through a socialization of private wealth.
Thanks, Stewart. Priya, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, I think Stuart's right. There are lots of examples of where countries are doing it better, but I don't think there is a gold standard model that we would want to adopt. And each country, and in fact each area within our country, each of our communities and cities, they're slightly different. So there's no one size fits all approach. It's about tailoring concepts and ideas, but ultimately with the emphasis on the end goal, which is to reduce those levels of inequality of income, wealth, and power, in order that the communities can prosper. Communities can't prosper with such enormous levels of income inequality and wealth inequality. So I think somebody else has asked it further down. Is the issue just a kind of moral one? What are the problems when we have these extreme levels of inequality. I can kind of touch on that now. There's so much evidence that shows that the structures in society just don't work. There's higher rates of crime, there's higher rates of teenage pregnancy, there's the life expectancy is lower, quality of life is lower, incidence of various kind of avoidable diseases are higher, crime rates are higher. So it's in the best interest of everybody to sort out our raging and rampant inequality. It's not just a kind of jealousy thing or keeping people back. The impacts on everybody in society are huge.
Thank you. Will, did you have anything else on that? There are actually a couple of questions about public attitudes that have come in, Will, that I'll put to you. I'll read the first from an anonymous attendee. So they say, we can talk about wealth inequality, but to who? The press are largely skewed in favour of the rich, or at least owned by the likes of Murdoch. A lot of people don't understand economics and politics, so how do we reach the masses if we're not in the political sphere? We do our best on social media and in our own essays, but how can we be more proactive? How can we find ways to cut across to people when we see these clickbait tabloid articles demonizing the poor? So it's kind of that, how do we address with people we know that kind of public perception of poor people? And then there was another question a little bit further down about inheritance tax. So what do you think we can do to reduce public aversion to inheritance tax? So it's kind of about changing our attitudes across the spectrum of wealth, if you wanted to speak to that.
Sure. So on the first one, I guess there's two parts to this. I mean, on just specifically on the media, it feels to me that the mainstream media's narrative on wealth inequality, and even to some extent on taxing wealth, is shifting slightly. And that's not just, in the Guardian, the Observer, that we are actually seeing people writing in places like the Times, maybe not the Telegraph yet, about some of these issues in ways that are much more favourable, much more supportive than they were a few years ago. So I think there is progress to point to there. And I think there, looking at the Conservative Party at the moment, there's obviously, in many respects, it's drifted further to the right than it was, but I think the sort of one nation strand of conservatism does understand the issues, even if it doesn't necessarily agree with all the suggested solutions. And to the extent that that strand survives and possibly even thrives within the Conservative Party, I think there is some cause for modest optimism. On reaching outside the kind of Westminster bubble, of that aspect of that question, I mean, it's a real challenge, and there are some people doing some great work here. So, for example, the former City trader, who's now an inequality economist, Gary Stevenson, has a fantastic YouTube channel which has around about 100,000 subscribers and is really doing good work at reaching out beyond that bubble, and we need more examples like that really quite urgently. On inheritance taxes, it's a great question. It's one of the most challenging taxes in terms of public perceptions, and Demos have done some really interesting work on public attitudes to inheritance and inheritance tax over the last few months. And one of the interesting findings from their research was that when you ask people in the abstract whether they support inheritance tax, almost everyone hates it. But then when you ask them very detailed questions about what level of inheritance tax they think is fair or what size of estates, the answers they give suggest that actually they support it and they support the principles behind it, as long as it's not seen as being something that it's not, which is something that's likely to affect them. So it's one of these most very difficult taxes to build support for, because misperceptions are rife and because people's feelings about double taxation and providing for their own and so on are so strongly held, even if not always based in reality. So it is challenging, but I think there's scope for a brave government to do something about it, notwithstanding the risk of a media backlash.
We can probably talk about the need for a brave government in a minute. Before that, Stewart, I have a question from Andrew Sayer on wealth extraction. And Andrew says, any suggestions on, firstly, how to reduce wealth extraction through control of assets without crashing the financial system, pensions and house prices? And the second part of his question is, how can redistribution fit with decarbonisation?
Okay, well, I'll take the last question first. So wealth and decarbonisation. I mean, what we know is that it's the super rich globally who are disproportionately responsible for carbonisation. I think the top 1% is responsible for something like half, whereas the poorest 10% contribute very little. So the process of redistribution it is on that basis a necessary condition for tackling climate change. I mean, on the question of wealth extraction, I think we need much more transparency. We need more regulation. I think we need to make some tough decisions about the whole private equity industry, which is it essentially exists largely to extract wealth and enrich its owners and investors, and it's a particularly worrying trend. I mean, that private equity is a classic example of how the process of enrichment is paid for by other people, by taxes, by staff, and so on. I mean, it involves a direct form of redistribution. What's particularly worrying about private equity, I mean, if you look at the high street, some of the biggest firms in the high street, BHS and Arcadia and Topshop and Debenhams, for example, have effectively been killed by the process of extraction of the wealth of those companies, therefore making them much more vulnerable to bankruptcy. But what's particularly worrying about private equity, of course, is that it's now expanding into to run traditional and vital public services. Social care, it seems to be dominated by private equity, and the same thing is now happening with children's services and daycare and various other things. So, I mean, it's above all, we need a government or political politician to recognise the problem, talk to business, new forms of regulation. I mean, I think you would have much tougher regulation. You can't ban private equity because you can't stop individuals setting up companies, but you can make them much more transparent or force transparency on them. That's a really big question and difficult to answer in sort of a minute and a half. But I think there are big things that can be done. In fact, we have to do it. And the whole effect of extraction is to weaken the economy. The main reason why we have low wages in Britain, low investment, low productivity, because the gains from economic activity have not been used to strengthen the economy, but to enrich the owners. I mean, this is a transfer from economic dynamism. I mean, it weakens economic dynamism because, cash cow companies are paying more in dividends than they are in investing in the future of the company.
Thanks, Stewart. You mentioned governments there, and I think we've mentioned it a couple of times throughout this session. And recently the Labour Party, I think there was a news article about how the Labour Party was opposed to higher wealth taxes. A couple of people have mentioned Labour Party in the questions. So I wondered if any of you could speak to this. And also it would be interesting to know if any, like thinking about how there will be a general election next year, are any of the parties incorporating more progressive tax approaches into their policies, even if not the obvious one of wealth tax. Or yeah. Priya, I don't know if you wanted to speak to them first.
Well, yes, Rachel Reeves has quite categorically, hasn't she, ruled out. Now I'm unsure whether she's ruled out wealth tax or taxes on wealth. But she did, and her kind of statement was something about, we have no plans to spend the money that would call for it. So I don't know if that's like a bit of an open door. I'm not 100% sure. We do know that the one of the things that Labour has done to tackle inequality head on is they have put commencement of the socioeconomic duty as part of their draft manifesto, and it's in their 5 missions. And that is an uncommenced part of the Equalities Act that was introduced in 2010. And when the coalition government came in, they took the socioeconomic duty out and commenced the rest of the act. And essentially, that has a requirement for public bodies to give due regard to socioeconomic deprivation in making strategic decisions. So that's if that's commenced, and it's commenced in Scotland and it's commenced in Wales, it's not commenced in England. It's voluntarily commenced by certain councils and other bodies. But that, if it was commenced nationwide, could be a very strong framework for which to kind of address and tackle inequalities over the board. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say particularly about taxes.
Just to say that as Priya says, Labour are obviously being very, well, both tight-lipped and very, very cautious on tax at this point. I don't think that necessarily stops them, or indeed any other government or coalition government, or who knows what we have after the election, thinking about, for example, equalising capital gains tax rates at that point. But it doesn't feel to me that there's any realistic prospect that any of the main parties are going to be adding that into their manifestos.
Thank you. There's a question from Colin about universal basic services, which is something you mentioned, Priya. You mentioned universal basic services, but not UBI, universal basic income, which gives people greater agency in spending and hence lifestyle choices. For UBS, UBI, how does the state establish entitlement and avoid cheating? And on the other side, people are falling through the net based on resident citizenship registration of some sort. I suppose the question is, what's the difference between universal basic services, universal basic income, and why are you landing on the side of universal basic services as a better solution?
Yeah. I think, well, some element of universal basic services does include some degree of, disposable income as well as providing the services. So that, I mean, it's kind of, it's a 2-pronged approach rather than just a single-pronged approach then, Colin. So I think about, just thinking about this entitlement and what have you, everybody should be entitled to shelter, to education, to opportunities. It's there for everybody. And I just wanted to kind of maybe touch on this different styles of approach. So I think in about 1900 there was a review of the kind of the kind of poor laws and how we approached our welfare state in the UK. And it took a long time to get produced. And essentially what happened was, instead of producing a single report for the Royal Commission, 2 reports were delivered. And one was called a majority report, and one was called the minority report. And the majority report was very much on entitlement and making means testing and making sure people weren't scrounging and aren't taking too much for what was the unentitled poor, I suppose, that you should be getting off your backside and doing more. So that was the majority report, and ensuring that people worked, jump through hoops in order to get benefits benefits, I suppose. And the other side, the minority reports, kind of said we need to create an atmosphere and a community where everybody has everything they need, their needs are met, in which then they can go on to then kind of flourish there. So this kind of dual approach of, do we it's the carrot or the stick thing, I suppose, is what they are, the majority and the minority report, the carrot or the stick thing. Here's my doorbell going with a delivery and the dog's going to bark any second. So essentially that's you know, has coexisted for centuries as two different ways of considering things. But we've seen so far that, you know, means testing isn't working. You know, it's not producing what we want it to produce. We have a welfare state system. We have universal credit. I think you've said here, there's mentioned there, Colin, people are falling through the nets. So I mean, why not try something new? And just, it's, you know, we've talked about, you know, changing the narrative and the conversation. You know, we've talked about people scrounging for avoid cheating. You know, well, what about the scrounging rich who are extracting all of these billions of pounds from our economy through the housing markets, through shares, through dividends, from getting paid by shares rather than via a salary so they can pay less taxes. You know, I think there was something like £35 billion in acknowledged COVID fraud. That wasn't people on universal credit. That fraud, you know, so that it's, if we want to look at scrounging and who's extracting more than their fair share, it's you know, it's there's two groups of people. Well, there's not two groups of people, isn't it? Yeah, let's look at the scrounging rich this time, shall we?
On that note,
that's my rant.
If you've got time. Okay, so we have.
Could I just come in briefly on the UBI versus UBS debate? I mean, firstly, they're not in contradiction, although some people put it like that. I mean, there is a resource question, how you fund them both. But if you look back at 1945, I mean, 1945 had both. I mean, it had an attempt to provide a minimum income, a guaranteed floor, along with National Health Service. So, you know, that started. But I mean, I think it's that what this is about is, you know, in the Poor Law, the Minority Report, I mean, Beatrice Webb, you know, argued for a guaranteed social minimum, that everybody should have a minimum, and that should include income and access to basic services. What's happened in the last, you know, sort of 40 years is that the principle of guarantee and universalism and collectivism has been greatly weakened. And the point about a guarantee, I mean, I think we should change the language. I mean, I'd like to use, you know, the term as a plimsoll line for incomes, i.e., you know, nobody should fall below a certain amount. And it is perfectly possible to devise a guaranteed universal non-means tested income at a pretty modest level that would actually cut poverty very significantly. In fact, it would cut it. I mean, calculations that we've done for Compass show it would actually cut poverty by over 50%, taking it to below the late 1970s level, the lowest point. So I really think we need to fire on both, seem to be both cylinders of access to services and guaranteeing income. So people have a freedom about how they spend the money. What happens at the moment is that, you know, that so much of income support is tied to spending in certain areas. So, you know, people, you know, the universal credit often has big deductions to pay the rent or to pay gas, etc. I mean, we're actually denying people the freedom to make the choices that they want. So I think income, you know, we mustn't lose sight of the power of a minimum income.
Great, thank you, Stewart. I've got quite a few questions coming in, and I want to get through as many as possible. So I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more and then give you all a minute just to round up. Thinking about resourcing things like EBS, UBI and taxation, Richard Turner raises the point about taxing the middle class as well. So he says, in my view, very rich people, billionaires, are able to shift wealth around, so taxing them is difficult. For me, middle class people also need to pay more tax to ensure we have better universal services. Priya, did you want to speak to that one?
Well, I think that's true, that you know, the very wealthy have got a lot of resources at their disposal in order to hide their money. We could look at other taxes as well for taxing, you know, middle class people. But if we look at what we're going to you know, the income that comes back in, we've got to look at where the biggest wins are going to be. So look at 50% tax on incomes over 150,000, for example, could raise a lot of money. So yeah, I think this isn't, what we've said here isn't the be all and end all, and it's definitely reviewing and seeing what is going to be sustainable and workable, and I think also we've touched on public support, what's going to get the biggest public support, but I think also we shouldn't just go after something because we think it's achievable.
Yeah,
we have got the skew of the and there is support from the ultra wealthy. We have got organisations like Patriotic Millionaires, or campaign groups like Patriotic Millionaires, saying we need to share more of the burden. So yeah, there are lots of different options to look at. Will's got your hand out. I'll stop talking.
I was going to go to Will with the public attitude side of this one.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, and this is building on what Priya was saying, I think it's very hard to build public support for increasing taxes on middle classes, however you define those, if you're not demonstrably doing more to tax people at the upper end of the income or wealth spectrum. And there's obviously that, it's difficult. There are technical challenges in taxing the very wealthy, especially when they're internationally mobile. And an annual wealth tax in particular is technically challenging, but there's been lots of work done over the last few years to show that it is feasible, even for the UK to take unilateral action, albeit that a coordinated global action would obviously be better. But there are plenty of taxes on wealth that can be designed that minimize loopholes. And in fact, by equalizing rates of tax with taxes on income, for example, are actually reducing rather than increasing opportunities for avoidance. So there is, and huge progress has been made on reducing corporate tax avoidance over the last couple of decades. There are opportunities to do similar things with taxes on individuals. So I think it's both possible and necessary for us to both ask the wealthy to pay more in tax, but also to reduce avoidance, which obviously tends to happen more at that top level, before we can ask those in the middle of the income distribution to pay more. Although the other complication is when you look at evasion, actually the huge amounts of tax evasion happening at lower down the income spectrum in terms of VAT, but that's just another complication, the curveball.
It's so complicated, but yeah, it's almost so complicated though that there are options and we don't know what they are. So yeah, I think so I have one more question from Jerry Mitchell, and it's about thinking to the future. And because we've only got 5 minutes left, I wanted to incorporate this into a summing up for each of you. So Jerry asks, or says, as someone said to me recently, it's not enough to oppose poverty and riches. You need to show we are all in an arms race that is taking us nowhere. So what is the panel's vision for a good society, Jerry says, in relation to the future of work and the future of the climate emergency that we can take to the public? So just really thinking of visions for the future, I think that's probably a good stepping stone to some summing up comments and wrapping the session up. Stewart, we'll go in the order that we've gone in. So Stewart, would you like to go first? I'll give you
I think
a minute.
That's a very, very good question. I mean, I think we all know, I mean, and the public know that the present system has grotesquely failed. The system that's been in operation for the last 40 years. It's created a broken economy and massive social problems and contributed to climate change. And if we do not change that model, then everybody will eventually suffer. And I think one of the implications of this model is that apart from the sort of top, 3 or 4% who've been able to abuse the system, everybody else has essentially their opportunities in society have been weakened by this sort of pro-inequality, pro-market, anti-state model. So I think, there should be a national consensus. And I think that's what we really do need to do. I mean, I think just going back to the pandemic, one of the early implications of what happened during the pandemic was this sort of, natural response from people who will suddenly say, look, the system is so unfair. The people who are saving us are the lowest paid, and so on. So there really was a sort of emotional and moral response, which seems to have disappeared. But I think this is such a golden opportunity. It's a kind of 1945 moment in which we could create consensus for a better society. And I think most people would sign up for that. I mean, I think the problem we have is we don't have political leadership that I mean, you need top down as well as bottom up. I think we're getting the bottom up, but not much of the top down.
Thank you, Stewart. Priya, summing up comments from you.
That's a great question, Jerry. It's a huge question. I think we've done many strategy days looking at the answer to this, and now I've been asked to sum it up into 5 words. So I think, continuing the theme of the universal basic services, everybody should have their needs met, in their basic needs met: food, shelter, housing, education, the right to participatory democracies, maybe looking forward to democratic budgets and participatory budgeting, so people have a say in what, and an agency and a channel to hold into account what's going on and how to impact the lives that are going on around them. And I think I just completely had a brain fog there when I was thinking of what I was trying to say. So yes, I think people to be having their needs met around them so that they can self-actualize and kind of go beyond just serving their basic needs of food, shelter, and education, so they can look forward to their future and have the ability to participate and have agency and influence over the world around them. Thank you. Will?
So my 3 words would be popularise the donut, as in the Kate Raworth donut, economics donuts, the idea that everyone has enough to survive and thrive, but that we're not consuming too much for planetary resources. That's where I think we need to be talking in terms of both a fair society and a sustainable economy. And I think there are reasons for hope in terms of where the public is at in the UK, notwithstanding the state of politics at the moment. The context has changed from 20 years ago. We're not so much blaming scroungers or immigrants for our problems. I think there is a real recognition of the role of wealth inequality in driving a lot of today's problems across the majority of people in the UK. And most people, want fair opportunities rather than necessarily a completely equal society. But they also recognise that inequality, in particular of wealth and income, are barriers to that and have to be tackled. And that's where I think there is this opportunity to build a consensus that would allow us to dramatically reduce inequality in all its forms.
Thank you all. There were some really powerful and quite hopeful final words. Really appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's joined us online. There's been some really fantastic questions and participation in the chat. You can see in the chat just now that there's a link to Stewart's book that you can order for just £10 with the code LAN50. We'll be sending you all an email to follow up on this webinar with a recording, a bit more information. So thank you. Thanks very much to the panelists. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.